One morning during August 1848, a British trooper was riding along a riverbank in Bengal, northern India, when he spotted a large sandy-colored wolf loping from her lair accompanied by 3 cubs. Such a sight was by no means unusual, but then the trooper saw something that made him pull on his reins. Following right behind the cubs was a small boy on all fours. The mother seemed to guard all of them with equal care, recounted another British soldier, Colonel William Sleeman, in a pamphlet he wrote a few years later. They all went down to the river and drank, without perceiving the trooper, who sat on his horse watching them. For a while, the horseman sat mesmerized by the bizarre sight of the child lapping at the water in the same way as the wolves. And then, just as quickly as a strange pack appeared, it started to head back to its den. The trooper giddied up his horse, determined to rescue the boy. But even riding as hard over the stony and uneven ground, he could not keep up with the wolves or the child. Within a few seconds they had disappeared. The trooper did not give up, and he returned a few hours later with a group of men armed with pickaxes to dig out the den. After they had excavated to a depth of 8 feet, the wolves and the boy darted out, but this time, the trooper was able to catch him. They took the boy to the village, but had to tie him, for he was very restive, and struggled hard to rush into every hole or den they came near, wrote Lehman. They tried to make him speak, but could get nothing from him but an angry growl or snarl. When a grown-up came near him he became alarmed and tried to steal away, but when a child came near, he rushed at it with a fierce snarl, like that of a dog, and tried to bite it. For the next 2 years, the boy continued to behave like a wolf, eating raw meat and refusing to wear clothes, no matter how cold the weather. Shunning human company, he preferred to make friends with stray dogs and would eat from the dishes. And then, 2 years to the month after he had been found by the trooper, the boy fell gravely ill. No one knew what he was suffering from, and the only time he was ever known to speak was when he pointed at his head and said it ached. He died that day. The story of a boy seemingly raised by wolves is just one of many that emerged from India in the 19th century. Tales abounded of children nurtured by wolves, many of whom were said to prove incapable of interacting with humans after they had been rescued. The phenomenon was treated with such seriousness that the respected academic journal, The Zoologist, carried an article on the subject by Sleeman in 1888. One of those who was aware of these tales was the author Rudyard Kipling, and there is no doubt he based the character of Mowgli in his much-loved The Jungle Book stories on accounts of man-cubs. With the latest movie version of The Jungle Book, featuring the voices of stars Bill Murray, Idris Elba, Christopher Walken and Scarlett Johansson, it is clear the notion of a child being raised by animals has an enduring appeal. In fact, such occurrences have been reported for centuries. A version is enshrined in the Roman legend of the twins Romulus and Remus, who were not only said to have been suckled by a wolf, but fed by a woodpecker. But are such stories true? Have there ever been any real Mowglis who have been raised by wolves or some other animal? Is it possible for an animal to raise a human? There are plenty of stories to suggest it is possible, with not just wolves and dogs, but sheep, bears, pumas, monkeys and even ostriches reputedly capable of being more than adequate foster parents. Of these, wolves and dogs seem to be the most likely to nurture a child. Take the case of Oksana Malaya, a 7-year-old girl from the Ukraine who was discovered in 1991 living on a run-down farm surrounded by dogs, having been abandoned by her parents 5 years before. When she was taken into care, Oksana was unable to speak, ran around on all fours and barked. More disturbingly, she cleaned herself in the same way as a dog. When the story of Oksana became public, she became known as Dog Girl, and it was reported she had been looked after by dogs, who had provided her not only with warmth, but had also effectively raised her. Oksana's experiences would be echoed 7 years later with the case of Ivan Mishikov, a 6-year-old who was given the name Dog Boy when Moscow police rescued him from the city streets, where he had been begging for 2 years. Ivan's only friends were a pack of dogs, whom he fed with the food he had scavenged. In return, the animals apparently provided him with warmth when he slept, as well as seeing off assailants. While Oksana appeared to have adopted many canine traits, Ivan maintained his humanity, though he could barely speak and was more likely to snarl. However, like Oksana, it did not take him long to learn Russian, and both have grown into normal adults, with Ivan having joined the army and Oksana working with animals on a farm. For other feral children, adapting to human society after years in the wild with only animals for company can be very difficult. In Uganda in 1988, a 3-year-old boy called John Sabunya witnessed his father murder his mother. He fled into the jungle and befriended a group of vervet monkeys with whom he lived for the next 3 years. When John was discovered in 1991, his story read like that of a real Mowgli or perhaps Tarzan. According to some accounts, the monkeys had fed him and he had swung with them through the jungle canopy. They guarded me and gave me protection, he later recalled. The monkeys used to love me, we played together all the time. What made John's story even more startling was that despite his youth, his body was covered in hair, which made him appear more simian than human. It took John many years to become human, and he was hampered by having learning difficulties. Today, John is 32 and fully rehabilitated, with a marvelous singing voice that has enabled him to perform with the prestigious Pearl of Africa Choir. His covering of body hair has disappeared. It was, in fact, a condition called hypertrichosis. Another person who claims to have been raised by monkeys is Bradford housewife Marina Chapman. In 2013, she published an extraordinary account of how Capuchin monkeys in Colombia helped her survive after she was abandoned in the rainforest by kidnappers who had botched her abduction. Marina claimed to have copied the monkeys' eating habits and high-pitched cries, and, like John Sabunya, had even learned to climb into the jungle canopy. I couldn't have been more excited, she recalled. So here was where they most liked to be. I had become fully part of their world. But can any of these extraordinary stories be all they seem? It is hard to find a scientist who will give them much credence. Many feral cases are hoaxes, vastly elaborated tall tales, says Marianne Oshoda, an anthropologist, TV presenter and fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. A child being raised by animals is a story that occurs in many cultures and has done so over a long period of time. However, I'm afraid the idea that an animal can raise a human child really has to be seen as the stuff of legend. In the tales of the supposedly real Mowglis, an association between a feral child and a group of animals is often overblown and spun into a nurturing relationship, in which the animal takes the place of a human parent. Ms. Oshoda met John Sabunya for a TV program she made on feral children. As she discovered, vervet monkeys are tolerant of human beings around them. They are also not the tidiest of eaters, she says. It's likely John was able to pick up their scraps and somehow believe the monkeys were giving him food. In fact, monkeys would not give food away, and the idea they would do so is simply to romanticize the brutality of child abandonment. As Ms. Oshoda points out, the stories of these children are really not about animals, but more about child abuse and neglect. The fates of these feral children can reveal uncomfortable truths about how we treat people who are different to ourselves, she says. So why do we persist in telling, and, indeed, believing, these tall tales of feral children? I think we develop these stories to try to establish what it is to be either a person or an animal, she says. Therefore, the stories of feral children act as a bridge between us and the animal kingdom, in which creatures become humanized and humans become more like creatures. The idea is a seductive one, and as long as we are still fascinated by our relationship with wildlife, then these stories will always be with us. Sadly, perhaps, they are more the stuff of Kipling than reality.